My classmates laughed when I said I'd be rich one day. I still remember exactly how that room sounded, the way the laughter bounced off the lockers and the old tile floor of Lincoln High like it had been waiting for a joke all morning. I was 17, standing at the front of a classroom that smelled faintly of chalk dust and cafeteria pizza, holding a sheet of paper about future career goals. The assignment was simple. Stand up, say what you wanted out of life, and sit back down. Most people kept it safe.
Teacher. Nurse.
Maybe a mechanic or a manager at their family's store. When it was my turn, I looked around the room at the same faces I'd grown up with since 3rd grade. Kids who knew exactly how warm my shoes were, who had seen me bring the same peanut butter sandwich to lunch every day for years. My family lived in a small rented house on the edge of town, the kind with peeling paint and a driveway that turned to mud every time it rained. My father worked long shifts fixing farm equipment. My mother cleaned offices at night. Nobody in my family had ever owned a business, worn a suit to work, or talked about investments or stock markets. Still, when I looked at that paper in my hands, something inside me refused to shrink. So I said it out loud. One day I'm going to be rich. There was a moment of silence. Not the thoughtful kind. The kind that happens when people are deciding whether you're serious or just setting yourself up to be the punchline. Then someone in the back of the room snorted. Another kid laughed. Within seconds, the whole class was laughing like I had just delivered the funniest joke of the semester. A boy named Travis slapped his desk and said, "Sure you will, Eleanor. Maybe you'll buy the whole town." Even the teacher smiled politely, the way adults do when they think a kid has an imagination that reality will fix soon enough. I felt the heat climb up the back of my neck. My hands tightened around the paper until the edges bent. For a second I considered saying I was kidding. That I meant comfortable, not rich. That I meant maybe owning a decent house someday. But something stubborn inside me wouldn't let the words come out. So I just nodded once, sat down, and let the laughter burn itself out around me. That moment should have faded away like most high school memories do, lost somewhere between yearbooks and old photographs. But life has a strange way of circling back to the things people once laughed at. 40 years later, I was standing outside a polished glass restaurant downtown at our high school reunion, listening to those same voices tell the story again like it was still the funniest thing they remembered about me. Someone raised a glass and said, "Hey, remember when Eleanor said she was going to be rich?" The table erupted with the same kind of laughter I had heard decades earlier, only now it was mixed with the clinking of wine glasses and the comfortable confidence of people who believed they already knew how everyone's story had turned out. I smiled politely, the way you do when an old memory gets dragged out in public. Then, through the tall front windows of the restaurant, headlights swept across the sidewalk. A long black Mercedes pulled smoothly up to the curb. The engine idled quietly. A man in a dark suit stepped out from the driver's seat, walked around the car, and opened the rear door. He looked directly toward the entrance and said calmly, "Mrs. Whitman, your car is ready." For a few seconds nobody at the table said anything. The laughter that had filled the room only moments earlier faded into a strange quiet, like someone had suddenly turned down the volume on the entire evening. A few people turned their heads toward the window, trying to understand what they had just heard. The man outside the restaurant stood beside the open rear door of the Mercedes, patient and composed, as if this moment was the most ordinary thing in the world. Inside, forks hovered in the air, and wine glasses paused halfway to lips. I noticed how the same people who had just been laughing were now staring at me with narrowed eyes, trying to solve a puzzle they had not expected to see tonight. Someone cleared his throat. Travis leaned back in his chair and gave a small chuckle, the kind people use when they're trying to convince themselves that something is still a joke. "Well," he said slowly, "looks like Eleanor came prepared for the reunion." A few people smiled politely, but the laughter did not return. I stood there calmly, smoothing the sleeve of my jacket the way my mother used to do before going into work at night. The room felt warmer than before, but not because of embarrassment. It was the warmth of attention shifting direction, like sunlight moving across a floor. For years these people had known me as the quiet girl with worn shoes and a lunch wrapped in wax paper. In their minds, that version of me had stayed frozen somewhere in the late 1970s. I could almost see the calculations happening behind their eyes as they tried to connect the memory of that girl to the driver waiting outside with professional patience. One woman leaned forward slightly. "Did he just say Mrs. Whitman?" she asked. I nodded once. The movement was small, but it seemed to ripple across the entire table. Someone near the end reached for a phone, pretending to check a message while secretly glancing up again to confirm what they had heard. Another man stood halfway from his chair and looked through the window more carefully, as if the car might disappear if he did not verify it quickly enough. The headlights from the Mercedes reflected softly across the polished floor near the entrance. The driver did not rush. He simply waited, hands folded politely in front of him, as if he had done this same thing hundreds of times before. I picked up my glass of water and took a small sip. The ice clinked quietly, a small sound in the middle of a room that had suddenly forgotten how to speak. Someone finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air. "Eleanor," a voice said cautiously, "what exactly have you been doing all these years?" It was a simple question, but the tone had changed completely from earlier that evening. Before, it had been curiosity, mixed with amusement. Now it carried something else entirely. Uncertainty. I looked around the table slowly, recognizing the same faces from decades ago, only older now, lined with time and familiar routines. I could still hear the echo of that classroom laughter from long ago, the sound that had followed me for years like a small stone in a shoe. I set my glass down carefully and smiled, not the embarrassed smile of a teenager trying to disappear, but the calm smile of someone who had spent a lifetime letting actions answer questions. "Just working," I said simply. Outside, the driver remained beside the open door, waiting patiently for the moment when I decided it was time to leave. No one at the table laughed after that. The energy in the room had shifted in a quiet but unmistakable way. People who had spent the evening speaking loudly now seemed careful with every word. Travis leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as if he were trying to study my face more closely. The years had added gray to his hair and softened the sharp confidence he used to carry in high school. "Just working," he repeated slowly, as though the phrase itself might hide a secret. Around us, the restaurant continued its gentle rhythm. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates and glasses, soft music drifted from hidden speakers, and conversations from other guests blended into a comfortable background hum. But at our table, the attention remained fixed in one direction.
Mine.
Someone else spoke up from across the table. It was Linda Harper, who used to sit 2 rows behind me in English class. "You mean you live around here?" she asked. I shook my head slightly. "Not anymore. I moved away a long time ago." That answer seemed to deepen the curiosity instead of satisfying it. People began exchanging quick glances, the kind that happen when a group realizes they have missed an important chapter of a story. Travis tapped his fingers lightly against his glass. "So, what kind of work keeps a driver waiting outside like that?" he asked with a half smile that tried to sound casual but did not quite succeed. I could see the tension between politeness and curiosity on his face. I had seen that same expression many times over the years in boardrooms and meetings. It usually appeared when people were trying to understand whether they had underestimated someone. I folded my hands together on the table. The gesture felt calm and familiar. "Transportation," I said. "Logistics, actually." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before anyone reacted. A man at the end of the table frowned slightly, as if he were searching his memory for something he had heard before. Linda tilted her head. "Logistics," she repeated. "Like trucking?"
I
nodded again. "Something like that." Travis leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "Well," he said with a small laugh that sounded more thoughtful than mocking this time, "looks like you ended up buying that whole town after all." A few people smiled at that, but it was not the same laughter from earlier. It was quieter now, edged with respect. I glanced toward the window again. The driver was still waiting beside the car, calm and patient under the soft glow of the streetlights. For a moment, I thought about that classroom many years ago, about the sound of desks scraping the floor and teenagers laughing at an impossible dream. Back then, I had believed success meant proving something to them. I had imagined a moment where everyone would suddenly understand that they had been wrong. But standing there now, watching their expressions shift from amusement to curiosity, I realized the truth was much simpler. Time had answered the question long before night. I had simply been busy building a life while they were still remembering a joke. I did not say anything else after that. The table remained quiet for a moment, and in that silence, I could feel something shifting in the room. Not disbelief exactly, but the slow realization that the story they remembered about me had stopped being accurate many years ago. Travis swirled the ice in his glass and glanced toward the window again. Transportation, he repeated, as if testing the word. That sounds bigger than you are letting on. A few people nodded. The curiosity had begun spreading around the table like a quiet ripple. I had seen that moment before in other places, in offices and meeting rooms across the country, when people started to sense that there was more behind a simple answer than they first assumed. I looked down at my hands resting calmly on the table. The silver watch on my wrist reflected the soft restaurant lights. For a brief second my mind drifted far away from the reunion, back to a much smaller room many years earlier. It was a tiny apartment above a hardware store in Dayton, Ohio. The carpet was thin, and the windows rattled every winter when the wind blew hard enough. I was 22 years old, sitting at a folding table that served as both a desk and a kitchen counter. In front of me was a notebook filled with numbers and sketches of routes across the Midwest. I did not have investors, partners, or experience. What I had was a used pickup truck that I had purchased with a loan from a small community bank and a promise I had made to myself a long time ago. During the day, I worked at a shipping warehouse loading freight onto trailers. At night, I studied how those trailers moved across the country, how products traveled from factories to stores, how timing and coordination could make the difference between profit and loss. It fascinated me. The entire country was connected by roads and schedules that most people never noticed. Somewhere along the way, I realized something simple. Everyone needed transportation. Every store shelf, every restaurant kitchen, every hospital supply room depended on trucks arriving exactly when they were supposed to. If someone could move goods faster and more reliably than anyone else, there would always be work waiting. That idea became the beginning of everything. I started small. 1 truck became 2. 2 became 5. Some years were slow and uncertain. Some nights I slept in the cab of a truck because there was no time to drive back to an apartment. But every mile of highway taught me something new about how the system worked. Back at the reunion table, Linda leaned forward slightly. "So, how long have you been in that business?" she asked. I returned my attention to the present and met her eyes. "Most of my life," I answered. Travis gave a thoughtful nod. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like you chose the right road." Outside the restaurant, the driver remained beside the car, calm and patient beneath the glow of the streetlights, waiting the same way opportunity had once waited for someone willing to chase it. Travis kept watching me the way people do when they suddenly realize they have underestimated someone. Around the table, the mood had softened into something quieter, more reflective. Linda folded her hands together and gave a small smile. "I guess we all thought you would move away and become a lawyer or something like that," she said. Nobody imagined trucks. A few people nodded, and I could see the curiosity growing again. Logistics was not a glamorous word. It did not sound impressive at first. But the truth about success is that it rarely begins with something glamorous. It begins with something practical that most people overlook. I glanced again toward the window where the Mercedes waited under the glow of the streetlight. The driver stood patiently beside the open door, checking his watch for a moment before returning his attention to the entrance. He did not look impatient. Professional drivers rarely do. They simply wait for the signal that it is time to move. I remembered another night many years earlier when there had been no driver waiting, no polished car, and certainly no reunion dinner. I had been standing beside a small truck stop outside Indianapolis at 2 a.m, holding a clipboard and watching a delivery schedule fall apart because a snowstorm had delayed 3 shipments. The driver beside me had shrugged and said the entire route would have to wait until morning. But I had studied those routes for months, memorizing the small highways and alternate paths that did not appear on the larger maps. I asked him to give me 20 minutes. We rerouted the trucks, called 2 warehouses ahead of schedule, and delivered every shipment before sunrise. That was the first time a regional distributor trusted my company with a major contract. Moments like that never appear in headlines, but they build foundations strong enough to hold everything that comes later. Back at the reunion table, someone leaned forward with growing interest. It was Mark Ellis, who had been quiet most of the evening. "So, how big is your company now?" he asked carefully. I could hear the genuine curiosity in his voice. The question was not meant to challenge me. It was simply the next logical step in a story that had become more interesting than anyone expected when the night began. I thought about the number for a moment. Numbers have a strange way of sounding either small or enormous, depending on how they are delivered. I chose the simplest answer. "We operate across 32 states, I said calmly. "A little over 900 trucks right now." The reaction around the table was immediate. Chairs shifted slightly. Someone let out a quiet whistle before catching themselves. Linda blinked twice, clearly trying to picture what that scale actually meant. Travis leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to admiration. 900, he repeated under his breath. 4. A moment nobody spoke again. Outside, the driver remained beside the car, calm and composed, while the headlights reflected gently across the restaurant window like a quiet reminder that some journeys start much farther back than people ever realize. The number seemed to settle over the table like a quiet weight. 900 trucks was not something people heard every day, especially not from someone they remembered as the quiet girl from a small-town classroom. Mark Ellis leaned forward again, this time resting both hands flat on the table as if he needed something solid to focus on. 900 trucks across 32 states, he repeated slowly. That is not a small operation. Linda let out a soft laugh of disbelief and shook her head. I cannot even picture that, she said. That must mean warehouses, dispatchers, drivers, the whole system. I nodded once. It takes a lot of people to keep everything moving, I said. The truth was that the company had grown far beyond anything I imagined during those early nights in the tiny apartment above the hardware store. Back then, I had mapped delivery routes with a pencil and ruler across a paper atlas spread over my kitchen table. Today, entire teams used digital systems that tracked every truck, every shipment, every mile of highway in real time.
But the principle had never changed.
Move things reliably, treat drivers with respect, and always keep your promises to customers. Travis rubbed his chin thoughtfully and looked out the window again at the waiting Mercedes. The reflection of the headlights flickered across the glass like a quiet punctuation mark at the end of the evening. You know, he said slowly, I remember that classroom day better than most people probably do. I remember thinking you were brave to say something like that out loud. I smiled faintly. Brave was not the word people used at the time. I replied gently. A few people at the table chuckled, though the sound carried more warmth than mockery now. Linda tilted her head slightly. Did you ever think about coming back here and telling everyone? She asked. It was an honest question, and I understood what she meant. Some people spend years waiting for the moment when they can return and prove that every doubt was wrong. But that had never been the reason I worked the way I did. I shook my head lightly. I was too busy building something to think about proving anything, I said. That answer seemed to settle into the conversation with a quiet kind of finality. Mark nodded slowly as if the idea made sense to him. Across the room, the restaurant lights dimmed slightly as the evening grew later and the dinner crowd began thinning out. Outside, the driver adjusted his jacket collar against the cool night air and glanced politely toward the entrance again. He had been standing there for nearly 20 minutes without complaint. That kind of patience reminded me of the early days of the company when every mile mattered and every decision carried weight. I looked around the table one more time at the familiar faces shaped by time and different lives. Some of them had stayed in the same town their entire lives. Some had traveled far and returned. But for the first time since the reunion began, nobody seemed to see me as the quiet girl with the impossible dream. Instead, they looked at me the way people look at someone whose journey they suddenly realized they had never truly understood. The table remained quiet for a few seconds after that realization settled in. It was the kind of silence that happens when people begin rearranging the stories they have believed for years. Travis slowly exhaled and leaned back in his chair, glancing once more toward the window where the black Mercedes still waited patiently beneath the streetlight. You know, he said thoughtfully, I think this might be the most surprising reunion story I have ever heard. Linda smiled faintly and nodded. I was just thinking the same thing, she admitted. All these years we wondered what happened to everyone. Turns out one of us built something none of us even imagined. Across the table, Mark Ellis had quietly taken out his phone. At first it looked like he was checking a message, but after a moment his eyebrows lifted slightly. He tilted the screen toward himself again, reading more carefully. Whitman Global Logistics, he said slowly, almost to himself. The name hung in the air for a moment before he looked up at me again. That is your company, is it not? I gave a small nod. The reaction around the table changed again, this time with a ripple of genuine astonishment. Mark turned the phone slightly so the others could see the screen. There is an article here, he said. It says the company expanded across the Midwest about 10 years ago and now operates distribution centers in several major cities. Linda leaned closer to see the screen. Oh my goodness, she said quietly. Travis looked over Mark's shoulder and let out a soft laugh that carried no mockery at all this time. Well, he said, I guess that explains the 900 trucks. I watched their reactions calmly, the way someone might observe a scene unfolding from a distance. Over the years, I had learned that success often surprised the people who remembered you from the beginning. Not because success itself was unusual, but because most people never imagine that quiet determination can grow into something powerful over time. Mark scrolled down the article and read another line out loud. Founded by Eleanor Whitman in 1987 with a single vehicle and one regional delivery contract. He paused and glanced up again. One truck, he repeated. That is where it started? I nodded. Just one. The simplicity of that answer seemed to affect them more than the numbers that came after it. Travis shook his head slowly. It is funny, he said. Back in school we all thought success meant something flashy. Big offices. Fancy titles. Nobody ever talked about trucks moving products across the country. I smiled faintly at that thought. Most important things in the world move quietly, I said. Outside the restaurant, the driver shifted his stance slightly, still waiting beside the car with the same calm patience. Inside, the small circle of classmates sat looking at me in a completely different way than they had when the evening began. The laughter from earlier had disappeared entirely, replaced by something much steadier. Respect. And for the first time since the reunion started, the story they remembered from high school was no longer the one defining the moment. The conversation at the table changed after that article appeared on Mark's phone. It was subtle at first, but easy to notice if you had spent enough years watching people during business negotiations. The tone shifted from curiosity to something warmer, almost careful. Travis leaned forward again, this time resting his forearms on the table with a thoughtful expression. I have to admit something, he said slowly. Back in school, I thought ambition sounded ridiculous when it came from someone who did not have much. I guess I was wrong about that. His voice carried none of the teasing edge it once had. It sounded more like someone recognizing a lesson they had learned too late. Linda gave a small nod beside him. A lot of us were wrong about a lot of things when we were young, she said quietly. Mark lowered his phone and looked around the table. You built something impressive, he added simply. That kind of growth does not happen by accident. I appreciated the honesty in his voice. Over the years, I had learned that respect delivered quietly often meant more than loud praise. Around us, the restaurant had grown calmer as the evening moved closer to closing time. A few tables were empty now, and the soft music playing in the background sounded clearer without the earlier crowd. Outside, the streetlight reflected gently across the hood of the waiting Mercedes while the driver stood beside it with the same professional patience. Travis followed my glance toward the window and smiled faintly. You know, he said, when we were 17, we all thought success meant having the nicest car in the parking lot. He shook his head slowly. Turns out it is something very different. Linda folded her hands together and looked at me with genuine curiosity. Do you ever come back here? She asked. To visit the town? I considered the question for a moment. The truth was that I had passed through this town many times over the years while traveling between distribution centers and meetings across the Midwest. But I had rarely stopped. Life had kept moving forward, mile after mile, contract after contract. Sometimes, I answered calmly. Mostly for work. Travis nodded slowly as if that answer made sense to him. Well, he said, next time you come through, you should let us know. I think we would all enjoy hearing more about how someone builds a company like that. A few people at the table murmured their agreement. The tone was not flattering or exaggerated. It sounded sincere. For a moment I looked around at the familiar faces that had once filled a high school classroom many decades earlier. Time had changed all of us in different ways. Some people had followed quiet paths close to home. Others had traveled farther. But in that moment something unexpected had happened. The old story they remembered about a girl with an impossible dream had finally been replaced with a new one. And no one at the table was laughing anymore. After a few more minutes, the conversation at the table softened into something calmer, almost reflective. People began sharing small updates about their lives, about children who had grown up and careers that had followed steady paths. But every now and then someone glanced toward me again, as if the evening had quietly changed the way they saw an old memory. Eventually, I looked toward the window once more and noticed the driver checking the time on his watch. He had been waiting with quiet professionalism the entire time, and I knew it was probably time for me to leave. I stood slowly from my chair and picked up my coat from the backrest. The movement caught everyone's attention again. Travis rose halfway from his seat as well. Heading out already? He asked. I nodded gently. It has been a long day of travel, I said with a small smile. Early meeting tomorrow morning. Linda stood up too and reached across the table to shake my hand. I am really glad you came tonight, she said sincerely. It is good to see where life has taken people. Mark gave a respectful nod. And thank you for reminding us that quiet determination can go farther than people expect. I appreciated the sentiment more than they probably realized. For many years, I had driven thousands of miles across highways that most people never noticed, building something piece by piece while the world continued moving around me. Recognition had never been the goal. The work itself had always been enough. Travis walked with me toward the entrance of the restaurant while the others followed a few steps behind. When the door opened, the cool night air drifted inside, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the main road a few blocks away. Outside, the streetlights cast soft circles of light across the pavement. The driver noticed us immediately and stepped forward, opening the rear door of the Mercedes with the same calm professionalism he had shown all evening. I turned back toward the group for a moment. The expressions on their faces were different now from the ones I had seen earlier that night. There was no laughter. Left only quiet understanding. Travis extended his hand and shook mine firmly. Safe travels, Eleanor, he said. And congratulations on everything you built. I thanked him politely and stepped toward the car. As I settled into the seat, the driver closed the door gently and walked back around to the front. Through the window, I could see my former classmates standing together beneath the restaurant lights, talking quietly among themselves as the evening wound down. The engine started smoothly, and the car pulled away from the curb with the quiet confidence of something designed to move forward. As the town streets passed by outside the window, I thought briefly about that classroom many decades ago and the laughter that had once filled it. Time had answered that moment in its own way, not with arguments or explanations, but with miles traveled, promises kept, and a road that had stretched much farther than anyone in that room had imagined.